Creating a cool fire breath simulation is one of those quintessential Houdini setups that really shows you how much fun this software can be. So it's a pretty simple setup and I definitely had to make a tutorial about this. The project file is available for download if you follow the link in the description. So this dragon animation I grabbed from Sketchfab, so I will provide you with a link where you can find this model, and we're gonna go ahead and let's bring this in Houdini and start from scratch. So I will just go up and create a new container here to the side. Let's rename this to import dragon, and let's just start from scratch here because there are a few things to take into account here, so I want to make sure that I cover all of it. Let's just go ahead and grab our Alembic animation, so I will drop an Alembic node and I will load in my dragon animation. Let's load unpack delayed load primitives and also throw down a convert here, so we are not working with packed geometry, and this is currently our animation. Now, depending on what kind of geometry you're importing from and the software that you're importing from, we can see that if I drop down test geometry Tommy and compare, this is not probably the actual size of the dragon, so we will go ahead and just use a transform. And right away I want to say that scale matters for this effect. So in order to get the realistic behavior of how a fire breathing effect would work in real life, we have to make sure that we are also working with the correct scale. So I'm roughly going to estimate that this dragon is at the very least at least way bigger, and in the original example that I did, I set the uniform scale here to a value of 50. So if I compare it to the size of human, it's around this size. It's probably even bigger, it's probably 100 times bigger, but I settled for a value of 50. I don't necessarily want to work with very high scale values either. So to split the difference between where it was and 100, I just settled on 50. And this is the whole reason why I wanted to re-import the geometry, just so I can touch on this aspect here. Scale does matter with this effect, or with any kind of simulation in general, so be mindful of that. Anyway, this will be fine. Let's just drop down a null here, and this will be my Geo Dragon, and I'll go ahead, Control C, and I'll just create a new geometry container for our effects. So this will be effects, let's just go effects underscore fire. And we will bring in our dragon back, so we have it in this network as well, and we can hide other objects now. So the first thing that we have to do is we are going to create a source that will essentially shoot out particles from our mouth. And now that I'm seeing this, let's just go up, let's go back to our dragon, and we can see that he only opens his mouth late in this animation. So what I'm gonna do is just drop down a time shift and push this guy forward maybe 100 frames, I think. So now if I check the animation, he opens his mouth around frame 46. Let's just push this forward maybe 130 frames. So it's a little something like this. And also very important here, because we are going to be using substeps later for our pyro simulation, it's just best to remove this integer frames option over here so that we are able to now evaluate this animation at each frame. So for example, if I do another time shift here, if let's remove the expression and get rid of integer frames, if I scroll further with smaller increments here, we can see the problem here is that it doesn't smoothly interpolate between frames, so we can see how it snaps. And this is also because in this time shift we have to set the expression here to $FF, right? So now we can see that we have the correct value, and no matter how smaller increments we have here, the Alembic animation will smoothly interpolate between each frame. So this is very important when we have substeps between each frame, that we have the correct animation in that specific substep. It won't probably affect the final result that much, but it's just a good practice to have to ensure that we are working with the right setup from the start. And this interpolation here is especially important when we are dealing with collisions. We won't have any collisions in this case, but again, it's just good practice. So let's go back back and let's go in our fire container, make sure that this is hide other objects. So first we will need to create our source that will spray particles opening from the mouth. So we somehow need to be able to track this entire region and attach our source to the head. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna go in a side view by holding spacebar 4, and I will press S on my keyboard, and I'm just gonna go ahead and let's grab the lasso tool, and let's just select roughly the head or portion over here, and I will press delete, and in this blast node let's delete non-selected, so we are only left with the head. So now we can get the average of this position. We can do an extract centroid, and let's set this to detail, and this will give me a point. Let's go ahead and let's turn on the display, go to geometry, turn on the point size so we can see this clearly. So this will do exactly what it says. It's going to compute the centroid of our geometry, and now we can see we have a point that attaches to roughly the center of our head, which is great. So we can attach the sources to this, and we can also offset this a little bit. So if I drop down a transform and I push this forward a little bit and maybe a little bit down as well, this transform will now apply on top of the animation that we already have. So it will follow the head's movement. Let's maybe bring this back a little bit so it's somewhere right in the center of the mouth opening. Something like this should be fine. So let's now go ahead and create our source for the particles. We can just use a simple sphere. Let's set this, let's zoom in on this with F, and let's set this to polygon and just increase the frequency, and we will do a mountain here so we can noise this up and have a little bit more of an interesting source here. Decrease the element size, decrease the amplitude. Let's do something like this, and let's also animate this because why not. So we will decrease the pulse duration, and we end up with something like this. Let's maybe make this animate faster. We want this to be a nice and chaotic effect, so most of these pulse durations for all of the noises will have a fairly low value, so it's nice and fast, which will lead to a more chaotic motion of our fire. So now in order to tell what size we need for this sphere, let's go ahead and just copy 2 points and point this to our centroid point over here, so the one we just found. And if I go to the result, this is now sticking to our geometry, and I can probably say that we can reduce the source scale here. Let's try maybe 0.1, and now I can go back to my noise. Let's reduce the noise as well. All right, and probably I think looks pretty good, nice and chaotic. Maybe let's decrease the amplitude to 0.1, and let's reduce this element size even more and just increase this to 0.15. Let's try something like this. Okay, this will be fine. Now we need a direction, so we need the particles to go in this direction, and we also want a little bit of spreading. And what we can do, we are going to create this direction at rest state. So when our geometry is like this at the center of our scene, we're just going to point this vector up and spread the vector a little bit. So let's go ahead and let's see how this works. What I want to do first is scatter a bunch of points. So I don't want to use the scatter option in the PopNet later. I want to scatter my own points so we have more control. Let's turn off relaxed iterations, and let's press D here, set this back to a value of 3, so the point size, and maybe just give this a little bit more resolution. So the first thing that I want to do is, and what I usually do, is introduce a little bit of variation to the density of our points, so how many points we scatter per surface. So for this we can just do an attribute noise float, and we can create this density attribute. We can name this anything we want here, so I'll just go with noise, and let's go ahead and create a visualizer for this. I will decrease the size here, the element scale. And now I just want to use this attribute to delete points essentially. So if I drop down a blast node, I can say that if the noise value is greater than 0.5, let's go ahead and set this to points. We can get rid of those points. So if I decrease this further, let's try, or maybe I can increase this 0.7. And now we can go back to our adjust float. Let's turn off the visualizer and let's just reduce the element size here. Let's do something like this. We can also remap map values, so we can delete more points or less points if we want. So we can do something like this, and of course we will animate this. So let's go to animation, animate noise, and let's also, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to set the pulse length to a low value, so we have nice and chaotic motion. So these are the particles that we are going to source in, as opposed to just having all of the points emitting at once. Again, this is just to introduce even more variation in our noise. And now let's take care of our velocity vector. So let's just start with an attribute VOP, and let's rename this to set V. If I step inside, let's just promote our V to a constant value, and let's just point this up. So if I set this V vector to 0, 1, and 0, we should just have a vector that points completely up. We can also create a visualizer for this. If I select this V over here, and let's turn on our visualizer, let's go to our V. This automatically created our point trails, so this is our current velocity. And now if I go to my copy to points, we need a way to align this V with our direction of the head, because currently this point that we created doesn't have any information for the directions. So we need to create a normal vector for this. If I go to my point, so if I look at my point over here in the center of the mount, we need a direction, so we need our normal to be facing the same direction as our head. And in order to do this, we can go to our geometry and we can grab one of the points from our geometry here. And the best point that I found for this will be one that's right in the center of the mouth. So if I press W to go to the wireframe, I can press S here, and let's press 2 to grab our point, and I'll just grab this one over here in the center. Let's press delete, and we can disconnect this blast node from over here and create a separate chain. So if I look at this blast node and I set this to delete non-selected, we have this point over here that's right in the center of the mouth. And now we can make our centroid point. So this one, we can make it look at this point that we just deleted from the center of the mouth, and we can use it to create the normal vector. So we are just using this point that we deleted here from the center to anchor our centroid point. So from here we can do an attribute VOP, and I will place this second point that we have in our second input, and let's go here and let's grab our second point's position, and we can do an import point attribute from the second input. So the PT_num value will be 0 because we only have one point, and if we do a subtract from our position to the second position and plug this inside the normal, let's turn on our normal display and we can see that we get this. Let's maybe also increase the trail here, so we can go to guides and we can scale up the normal to, let's use a value of 1. So this will be now our direction, and it's always going to be facing in the same direction as our head, as we can see over here. Well, almost. I think we're pretty close. We get something like this. So now we have this point that's following the center of our mouth essentially, and it's also pointing in the right direction. And now if I go back to my copy to points, we almost have what we are looking for. We can simply rotate this geometry. So after our attribute VOP over here, we can drop down a transform and we can rotate this 90 degrees on the X. So I'll set this value here to 90. And if I go back to the copy to points, it's going to use this rotation and it's going to align it with the normal from our point, and we get this result. So now if I just do a popnet here from our copy to points, let's go inside and let's turn off the guide. Emission type here, as we mentioned, we already scattered our own points. So here I will set the type to all points, and we should already have something happening here. If I press play, something is happening, but obviously we will need to increase the velocity. So in the attributes tab, we can scale up our velocity vectors. So let's start with a value of 10 here. And now if I press play, we kind of get what we want. Let's also go to the birth tab, and we don't need these particles to last this long. So let's set the life, let's maybe try 0.4 and 0.1. And also in the attributes tab, let's set this to add to inherited velocity, and this will also introduce a little bit of variance in our velocity, so it will make it more like a spray effect. So we end up with something like this, and from my previous example I know that I ended up with a velocity value of 15 over here, so it was something like this. and this was roughly the speed that I needed. So right away I want to mention that the inherent velocity value here, so this value, and also how long the particles last, will drastically affect the look of this effect. So these are very important parameters that I did a lot of tests until I got right. So the life expectancy and again the inherent velocity, these are very important to play around with and test things out. Because for example, I think the inherent velocity kind of makes sense, right? So if I increase this to 25, then our fire will move even faster. So let's set this back to 15. But also how long the particle lasts will determine how far the fire is being pushed. So if I set this to a value of 1 and I make them last for a longer time, our fire will be continuously pushed by these particles. So if I set this to a lower value, the fire will have an initial push and then it will sort of slow down a little bit when there's no longer any particles to push the fire around. So it's only going to continue moving from inertia. So these are just values to be mindful of. So we are almost ready with our particles. One thing that I want to happen is I don't want a continuous emission. So I want to source the particles in and then I want to fade them out. So our sourcing, let's go back to our transform over here for our source and let's see if we can animate these noise values. So this noise value over here, we can see if I decrease or increase it, we source in more or less particles. So we need a way to control this. The easiest way is to just add a float parameter here. So I will just drag a float value in my root and let's rename this label to anim, and also the parameter, let's set the name to anim. So we will control this value with this float instead. So let's copy parameter and let's get rid of this and paste relative references. And now I can increase or decrease this. And let's just go to the parameter interface and we'll set the range here. Let's use a value of 1 and hit apply and accept. So it's just a little bit easier to control. So we can start from no particles, so roughly a value of 0.19. Let's look at our dragon animation and decide when our emission should start to happen. So we can take a look at this animation right when he opens his mouth, maybe from this frame, so 12. Alt and left click on this animation and we can increase this over a duration of, let's say, maybe a few frames. So at frame 16 we should have some emission happening, so we will just increase this value. Let's press F to zoom in. Let's do something like this. All right, and now let's go back to our dragon. So we are going to keep emitting values and then we can see now that the mouth closes, so we can add another keyframe for the same value here, go forward in time maybe another few frames, and then scale this back down to roughly 0.1, which should get rid of all of the points. All right, so if I look at this animation, we will bring in points for a few frames and then we are going to stop emitting any points. So if I go to the popnet, we should have our particles stop emitting. So this will be the result and we can play around with the timing even more, and I encourage you to do so, but this will be fine in order to move along with the rest of the setup. And finally, for our velocity, let's go back to the rest state for the points and also preview the velocity. And maybe let's preview this before we did the rotation. So in our set V, we also want to add a little bit of noise here. So let's go ahead and after this set V, we can just do a point velocity. Let's set this to keep incoming and just go to the curl noise tab, and I'll reduce the swirl size and the scale and also the pulse duration. And let's maybe decrease this even more. And this will essentially determine the spreading, so we can already kind of have an idea on how the points will now spray. So if I go back to my simulation, let's take a look. So we now have the spreading as well. And I think that this is already looking pretty decent. So now we can start creating our attributes that we need for Pyro. Now for this specific effect, we are only going to need the burn and the temperature. And we want to add noise to these values. So we can do an attribute noise float. And the first one will be burn. So let's also preview this, create a visualizer. Let's disable the velocity and look at our burn. We can pretty much leave these settings as they are. I might just decrease the element size And we also, of course, want to animate this. Let's set the pulse duration to 0.25. And we can also play around with the ramp here. So I might want to squeeze these values a little bit. Now, the problem with doing our attribute noise after our popnet is that this noise pattern, we can see that it's pretty much swimming over the points. So it's not sticking to the points. And while this isn't necessarily a deal breaker in the case for Pyro, it's not really the ideal solution. So what we can do is simply just add this onto our source point instead. So I'll just add this after our point velocity. And now if I preview the simulation with the popnet, we can see that this burn attribute that we created is going to stick with the movement of the particles. And I can also tell that probably this element size for the noise needs to be even smaller. So I'll set this to 0.15 and let's take a look. Maybe we can go even further. Let's try 0.07. Let's press play. All right, so I think this will offer us plenty of variation for our burn. And we also want to do the same for our temperature. So I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate my burn. And for this duplicate, we can just change the name here to temperature instead. And just to have even more variation, we can change the offset of our noise. And we don't really have to preview our temperature because it's going to be pretty much the same as our burn. So we can always come back and adjust these values later. But now we can go ahead and use our particles to create the source for the smoke. So we are going to do a volume rasterize attributes. Let's rasterize our burn and temperature. And right off the bat, let's decrease the particle scale to, let's try 0.1. And this particle scale matters a lot over here. So we will have to do some tests with this value. And after we simulate, we can decide if this is too big or too small. So we will see this in a second. We also have velocity for our points. So we can turn on the velocity blur and we can increase the shutter. Let's set this to smear backwards and also increase our blur samples. And we can see these very harsh areas right around our particles. That sort of kind of looks like an error. So this is not really ideal. And this will be apparent in our simulation as well. So we will just turn on this normalize by clamped coverage, which will smooth everything out. So this will be the burn and the temperature, and I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate this by holding Alt, and I want to rasterize the velocity attribute in a separate node because I want to add some further noise to this velocity. So after we determine the movement with our popnet, we can also do a point velocity over here. Let's set this to keep incoming. And we can turn on the display point trails here. We can go to the curl noise and let's add curl noise, and we will increase this scale a little bit. And also we can play around with the swirl size, and of course we can decrease the pulse duration. So this is the reason that I want to rasterize this in a separate node, because if I were to do our point velocity display over here and go to the volume rasterize, this velocity blur will no longer be entirely accurate, because with this point velocity it kind of disrupts our velocity. So we can see that as I turn this on and off, we have a little bit of weird velocities. This might not be apparent at this voxel scale, but it can mess things up when you go to a higher resolution. So usually I just like to separate all the attributes. So if we had density, we would separate this as well from our velocity. Let's go ahead and merge these back by selecting them and holding down Alt. So now they are back together and we have all the volumes here, and we can go ahead and finally start doing some simulations. We will drop this inside a Pyro solver. And let's straight away link the voxel size of this Pyro solver. So let's copy parameter and paste relative references. So we want our sources to be the same resolution of our Pyro solver. So we can already change some settings here. Because this is a rather fast moving simulation, we will need at least 2 max substeps here, but I found that a value of 3 was even better. I generally wouldn't go higher than 3, like no matter how fast the smoke simulation is. Generally 3 values should be fine for 99% of cases. Also, we can turn on this advection or reflection here. so I will set this to single project. And this is also a very good option when you have very fast moving smoke. Generally, when the smoke is moving super fast, it tends to lose a lot of volume really fast because of the way that the density is pushed around by the fast moving velocities. So with this advection reflection option turned on, this will preserve the volume a little bit better. This will slow down your simulation a little bit. So be mindful of this. You can do some tests with or without this and see if you get similar results. So it might not be needed in some cases to turn this on. But anyway, let's go forward. We are not interested in the bounce for now. We don't have any collision, so we can go to sourcing and let's take a look over here. We have the defaults that the PyroSolver provides. Let's just go ahead and get rid of all of these and start from the top. We have our burn. So let's source our burn into our flame, and the operation here should be maximum. So we don't want to accumulate this value. And let's go ahead and also source in our temperature as well, and we will set this temperature to max. So temperature will go into temperature, and finally we will have the velocity. So let's source in our velocity. This will be a vector, and the name will be v, and the target field will be vel. And we are going to change this in a second, but let's just leave this at add for now and see what we get with these options. So if I press play, all right, we kind of get a decent result. We even have a little bit of noise, and most of the breakup that's happening in this smoke is gonna come from this, let me make some room here. It's gonna come from this point velocity here. Otherwise, we really shouldn't have any breakup that much because we are not using any turbulence or disturbance yet. So this is why this point velocity node here is useful for us. Let's go back to our sourcing. And let's also go ahead and preview this with a pyrobake volume. Because we are going to render this with this pyrobake, it's going to be useful for us to preview the final result instead. And I will disable this assign material. Let's go ahead and turn on the scatter and also the fire. Now currently nothing is showing, and this is because in our scatter volume we don't have yet a density field. So if I go to the bindings tab here, go inside scatter, we need this mask volume which is looking for the density, but we haven't created the density yet. So just for now I will disable the scatter, so we can see that basically we just have the fire now, which is binded to our temperature. So if I go in the temperature, this is looking for the temperature, and we also have a mask option here that we will enable later when we have the density. But we can take a look, and this is the current result. So right away we can decide if this fire can emit density. So it can be a smokeless fire, but if we create the density, we will have access to the scatter field here, and we can use it as a mask in our fire as well and just create a more visually pleasing results. So we are going to use density for this, and we can generate this density from our flame field. So if I go in the PyroSolver, let's go ahead and go to the fields here, and we can turn on this option to emit from flame. And here we can determine the flame range. So if we have flame values that are below 0.2, we won't have any density, and it won't add more densities over values bigger than 0.5. So if I simulate for a few frames, we should already have a little bit of density. But now that we have a few frames simulated, we can compute range, so we can see how far our flame field can go, and we can see that the default values were pretty accurate. So let's just set this to 0.5, and let's also set this back to 0.2. So we don't want to have density in areas that don't really have high flame values. And we can also turn on the remap flame range here. So we have a smooth transition between the lowest and the highest values. And we want the operation, we want this smoke to accumulate, so we can set this operation to add. For our temperature, I will also turn down the cooling rate. So this is how fast the temperature dissipates. So I want this to last a little bit longer to have more flames and stuff. So I'm just gonna reduce the cooling rate to 0.1. And we can also emit more temperature from flame. And this I found that creates a little bit more of a realistic result. It doesn't really change the overall simulation that much, but it's a nice thing to have. So I'm just gonna set this operation to add, And again, for the flame range, let's go with the same 0.2 and 0.5 values from earlier, and I might scale this down to 0.5. Now, these are all values that you will have to adjust and make a lot of tests. So you can make a test with this emit from flame and another test without this option and see what different results you will have. So in general, all of these settings need a lot of tweaking. Also in this tab, I will turn on the speed fields. So now we can map different microsolvers to the speed of the simulation. And now finally, to optimize things a little bit, we can cut essentially the fire when it's outside of the camera. So I'm gonna go ahead and place my camera Frustum HDA, and this will be included with the project file. If you download this, you will just have to place it in your OTLs folder. Let's go and let's point this to our camera, and we will increase the size on the X here so it passes where the fire would be, and also introduce some padding here. So I will set the X and Y values to 1.2 and 1.2. And if I press W, I think this should be enough. Let's look at our fire and template this. All right, so when the fire pretty much passes this region, we can go ahead and delete our fields essentially, so it no longer simulates, so we waste time simulating things that are outside of the camera. Now in our sourcing, there is an option for the sync volume, but I really have no idea how that works and how you're supposed to use it. So if you know how the sync volume works inside of Pyro, please point me to some resources in the comments, because I really I couldn't figure this out. But so what I did was I grabbed the camera Frustum, and this is a closed geometry, so I can do a VDB from polygons, and I turn this into an SDF. We don't really need super accurate voxel size here, so we can just leave this at 0.1, and I just want to have enough region outside of this SDF, so I want to have enough information outside the borders so that our fire can interact with what happens when it's outside of our camera Frustum. So for this, let's use world space units for narrowband and just increase the exterior band. So I can press W, and as I increase this, we can see that we introduce more voxels right around our SDF. So now we can sample these voxels inside our Pyro solver. So let's go ahead and drop a null from here and rename this to SDF so we can point to this. I will grab this, Control C, let's go inside the Pyro solver, and we can use a gas field VOP, and let's plug this in our force output, and we will go to the inputs. Let's turn on input 1 and point this to our SDF, and inside here we can grab the sample of this SDF. So we will do a volume sample from op input 1. Let's do a volume sample it from our position, and we will compare this value and say drop down a compare node. So let's maybe just go up so I can explain this a little bit better, what's going to happen here, and just simulate a few frames. Now, when I simulate this, I can probably tell that this is a little bit too slow, so I can just go to my PopNet here. And this is what I said earlier, that let's step inside, and if I increase the life expectancy, we will push the fire even further, so I can increase the life expectancy. Let's try in 0.6 and introduce more variance as well. And we will leave the inherent velocity at 15. So now our points are lasting longer, so it will push the smoke even further. And maybe this is spreading too much, so I can go to my point velocity for the noise, and let's just drop the scale so we have a little bit less spread. All right, I think this should be good. Let's go ahead and simulate more frames here. Let's go ahead and let's set this voxel size to 0.1 just so we can have a faster simulations, so we can continue with the setup. All right, so we can see when the smoke is reaching the outside of the bounds of our camera Frustum, we can go ahead and just delete all of these fields right over here. We will cut them off, and we are using the SDF for this, so we have values right outside this region. And since this is an SDF, we're gonna have a sample value of 0 right on the border of the camera. And the further away we get from the border, we're gonna have increasing positive values. And inside the SDF, we have negative values. So we can simply sample the SDF and say that if your value is greater than 0, so this will mean that you are outside of the SDF. So if this value is greater than 0, we will go ahead and just force all of the fields, so the burn, temperature and density, we will force them to 0. So this will get rid of them and we will no longer have to simulate anything there. So in our PyroSolver, let's go back in the gas field op, and here we grab our sample of the SDF, so we can say that if this is greater than 0, we will grab all of our fields and set them to 0. So let's go ahead and do a bind on our burn, and we will export this back to our burn. Let's turn on use this node to set parameters and set this to always. So now essentially this is a bind export. So we'll plug this here, and this compare node will give me a value of 0 if the condition is not met, and a value of 1 if the condition is met. So we want the reverse of this. We want a value of 1 if it's inside and 0 if it's outside. So we can do a complement for this to revert this result, and we will multiply our burn with this complement. So we'll plug this here, and for example, this is a noticeable with the burn field, but we can cut the density in real time, so we can do the same with the density. Let's copy this and set this to density and export this back to density, and set this to always and use this node to set parameters. Plug this here, and if we do a multiply with this complement value, when I plug this, we should see this now. It's cut right where our camera frustum is, and the only field we have left is going to be the temperature. So let's do this for the temperature as well. Let's grab all of these, copy them over, and let's set the name for this to be temperature. Control C, and let's paste this over here. And actually we still haven't got rid of this, and this is because I'm cutting off the burn, but the actual field is called flame. Burn is the name of the source field, but we are sourcing it to create the flame field. So this name here should be flame. So let's set this to flame and this to flame as well. And now we got rid of this. So now this will optimize our setup a little bit, and we can see that there's no longer any smoke here. So let's go back to our camera and let's run a higher quality test. Let's use 0.05. Timescale is also something you can play around with, especially in this case with a very high moving smoke. It might be beneficial to increase the timescale. You can try something like 1.5, and let's simulate this. Maybe we can also do a cache pyro test, and let's save to disk. So let's go ahead and re-simulate. So I'm just gonna click reset simulation, and now we should have some smoke. So let's go to our pyrobake and let's increase this density scale over here, so we can see we have a little bit of density. Maybe we can turn down the fire so we can start to see the smoke a little bit better. And we can play around with the source range here, so I can increase this. And now that we have density, we can actually go, let's disable the fire for now. Let's go to our scatter field, and now we can see that this is working sort of as it should. So we can play around with the settings here, and I might want to increase the blurring here, and also these are settings that you can go back and forth with to get a cool result. And now there's not a lot of use doing this now, since we are working with low quality resolution and we still have a lot of settings to adjust. So the first thing is going to be to add disturbance to this. So let's go to the shape tab. Let's turn off disturbance, and we will map this to our speed. So I will turn on the use control field. And if we simulate a few frames and hit compute range, we can see that we get really high values. Now, we don't really want to use this as our upper threshold for the disturbance. we will set this to a rather low value, so we can use something like maybe a value of 3. So this will mean voxels that have a speed larger than this value of 3 will no longer get even more disturbance applied to it. And we are going to set this to a rather high value, so we can use a value of 15 here. What we really need in this control field is this minimum threshold for the control range. So we have to set this, let's set this to 0.5, which will mean that when our smoke slows down, it will no longer get disturbed. So we are going to only disturb the very fast moving parts. So we're going to break them up, and then when the simulation slows down, it will already be broken up, so we will have a lot of features, and we can just leave those alone and just simply simulate them as we normally would. So this is why this lower threshold here is very important. So let's go ahead and let's do another test, and we should already start to see this is already looking way nicer. We now have a lot of features to play around with. Let's go back to our Pyrobake and also enable our fire. And maybe I can play around with the source range. And in our fire, I'm also going to turn on the masking option here to mask it with the density. And we can go ahead and increase the mask center here and play around with the settings. And we'll come back to this in a second. Maybe I can also go to the smoke here, and I want to just darken this a little bit. Okay, so we're looking pretty good. Now we can also add divergence to this if we want more spreading, but we can increase the spreading of this by adding flame expansion. So in the shape tab, let's enable flame expansion here. And let's take a look at the settings. We are mapping it again to the flame range. Let's set this again. Let's maybe use 0.2 and 0.5, so the same values that we kept using. And we have to play around with this expansion rate, but let's see what the default will give us. So we should have a little bit more spreading. Let's maybe look through our camera. And one thing that I should have done from the start, we can see that the smoke starts to rise over here, and I don't really want that. Now this is the correct behavior that's supposed to happen because smoke rises from the heat, and there is a lot of heat over here. But for this specific shot, I want the smoke to just go straight down, because from this angle I'm not really interested in having the smoke rising. So I will go to the buoyancy value here and just disable this, and now our smoke will no longer rise. So this will be specific for this shot and from this angle. Usually you will probably want to have this on. But anyway, if we resimulate now, we should no longer see our smoke rising, and as a result we are going to push this fire even further in this direction of the breathing. So we are getting pretty close, I would say. Of course, we can still turn on the turbulence, so I'm just gonna turn this on because I always turn this on. Basically, let's leave this at temperature, and let's maybe increase the threshold range so we don't have as much everywhere. And I will just use a larger swirl size for this, and maybe a lower amount, and it should be fine. I might even want more disturbance. Let's try a value of 20, and I can also add more disturbance if I decrease the minimum range here. So I can set this to a value of 0.3. This might be a little bit too much, but we'll just have to see. So we're getting pretty close. We can go ahead and maybe decrease the voxel size. So let's increase the resolution. Let's use 0.05 and see what we get. The final resolution that I used for this was 0.025, so this will bring us pretty close, I would say. Okay, I think I kind of like this, to be honest. It has we can see that this has a lot of directionality to it, so I actually think this is looking pretty cool. Now, there is this thing, we see this mushroom cloud kind of thing happening, and this has been a problem with pyro simulation since forever. And the ways to fix this is to disturb the velocity that's coming in. So this is why we have this point velocity, so we can add noise on our source here. Let's set this back to a value of 2. And if we have more noise on our velocity, we are going to have more breakup. But also this mushroom cloud is happening because the velocities are changing too fast. So this is sort of going from 0 to 100 in like half a second. And this is where the mushroom cloud starts start to appear. So what we can do to fix this is go back to our sourcing here, and in our sourcing tab, and instead of adding our velocities, we can pool them. So this pooling is sort of like a blend. And when we are working with vectors, we will have to turn on the direction strength here as well. And now the default settings for this, if I play the simulation, now we won't really have enough velocities, but we can see that we got rid of that mushroom clouds, but now the flames are not really being pushed enough by our particles. So what we can do is increase the acceleration strength. So I will set this to a value of 50, and this acceleration strength will determine how fast we blend in the velocities. So for example, if this were like 1000 here, it will probably give us the same result as a regular add, but we will set this to a lower value, but still pretty high. So a value of 50 will bring the velocities in pretty fast, but it won't be as fast as the add operation. So this is all that we are interested in. We want to blend in the velocities. So because we are blending in the velocities, they won't be as strong and harsh and create that mushroom cloud look. So now as a result, we should still have the fire being pushed by our velocities. And now that we are blending in the velocities, we can see that we still have a little bit of the mushroom cloud look, but we got rid of some of it. It's not really as apparent. We can even try a lower value here. So if I try 25, we are gonna have even less of a mushroom cloud, but now our velocities might not be strong enough to push our fire enough. So you will need to find a balance with this acceleration strength between having too much of a mushroom cloud and too less of the smoke being actually pushed by the velocities. But for my example, I think I used a value of 50. And let's take a look at the result. All right, we probably have too much smoke now that I'm seeing this, or rather our pyrobake isn't configured properly. Let's just disable the scatter. All right, let's go back to the fire. And even though this is a pretty cool effect, I think the time scale really turned this look, it made everything a lot more chaotic than it should be, I believe. Let's take a look at some of the settings here. I will set the time scale back to 1, and maybe also I can reduce the disturbance a little bit. And also in the pyrobake volume, we can bind the fire instead of the temperature, where the temperature is going to be everywhere. We can bind it to we can bind the intensity to the flame instead. So the flame volume dissipates faster than the temperature. So we won't have really bright areas everywhere. And I can now go back to my settings here for the fire, and I can increase this back and also play around with some of these other settings. Maybe I can decrease the smoke density, and let's turn on the scatter back, and let's decrease this intensity, play around with some of these other settings. All right, so now we have so now I think it looks a lot better, but still we have too much breakup. I would say we are kind of missing that directionality that we had earlier. So this is where all of the tweaking will start. So you have to play around even with the scatter amount. So if we scatter more points over here, so all of the tweakings really starts right from the beginning. So if I increase more points, if I scatter less or more points, this will give us a different result. Also in the volume rasterize, we can play around with the particle scale. So we can also decrease this or increase this, and it will give us different results. And really at every step, you will need to go ahead and do tests and tweak things and turn certain things on and off and see what different results you will get. But this is essentially the setup. And like I mentioned in the beginning, if you want, you can go ahead and inspect the heap file that I provided. So here you can find all of the settings that I used in order to get this look. So if I go to my cached result, let's take a look. I think the pyrobake is not working properly. Let's maybe see. And here it is. Not the super highest resolution. I think we are working with a fairly low density grid, I would say. We could probably push this further, maybe to a value of 0.001. But for this camera angle, and for this shot, this was just fine. So go ahead and inspect this project file if you want. And to create this shader inside the Redshift, you have to go to the Pyrobake volume, and inside the bindings tab, the last property here will be bake emission volume. So you have to turn this on, and then in my material settings, let's go to the fire here. We have a simple volume shader that's attached to the volume input for the Redshift material here. We are mapping the scatter to the density, and here I'm using a fairly low scatter coefficient compared to the absorption coefficient. So this is what's going to make the smoke appear thicker or more transparent by increasing the absorption coefficient. So this is very important. And then for the emission, I set the name of the channel to the CE name that is created by us right over here. So this will have to match the name we give it in our channel in the emission tab. Set this to a scale of 2, and then for the color mode, this is also very important. We have to set this to replace. Color channel, again, we will point to CE, and then emission mode, we'll set this to color ramp. So this is how you can render the fire inside Redshift. And then I did a very fast comp in Nuke. So this is how I rendered this out with the dragon and the fire, and we can see that the fire already looks pretty good. But for the dragon, I split all of the AOVs for the diffuse, reflection, and there's a couple of lights, and we can see that I have AOVs for all of the lights. So I put the AOVs for the dragon back together, and I merged this on top of a ramp. So this is just a simple ramp with some noise that travels in the direction that the dragon is flying. So I merged this over here, and then on top of this, I separated the smoke with all of the lights. So I just have a couple of lights here. There's a sun and a couple of dome lights, and when you put them all together, you get the density. We can plus this on top of our comp. And then from here, I separated the entire volume lighting of this pass. And if I subtract my Redshift light, so this pass from this one, we can separate only the GI of the volume. So then we can paste this on top after we do some changes here with the grading. And on top of this, I see that I placed this fog layer. So this is created in Houdini. So this is just a very simple fog layer created from the camera frustum directly inside Houdini. It's just a volume with some noise that's moving in the opposite direction of the dragon, essentially. So very simple, and it's included in the Houdini project file if you want to check this out. So we add this on top, and here we have the fog emission. So actually I just faded this out with a grade node, so it's not as strong when the dragon essentially stops the fire breath. I just faded this out, otherwise it looks like this. So when we add this on top, and this operation here should be plus, we can see that with this first grade node that controls the animating, we fade off the emission. So I think it just looks a little bit more natural like this. And then we are using AP Glow on the emission. So this AP Glow is available on Nukepedia, and it's a very good exponential glow. And we plus this on top. We add some motion blur, and we can see that with the motion blur, we really get rid of a lot of this kind of like this voxel stepping thing that's going on over here. So this is why I don't usually worry when I render volumes directly inside Houdini. I don't worry about setting up the motion blur to happen directly at render time, because the motion blur inside of Nuke really works super well, and it really does wonders, especially for volumes. It works really well with particles, but with volumes it just does a super nice job, and hopefully you can agree with me. And finally, just because I want to be fancy, I added a simple flare here, and I multiplied it with the blurred result of the AP Glow. So if I go to this, so from my glow layer, I blurred this out, and I think I graded this up, and I can use this to multiply the flare. So it's only happening when we have really bright spots on our screen, and when we add this on top, this is with just a little bit of flaring happening over here. Nothing super fancy. This entire shot probably needs a lot more work, even with the simulation and everything, but I just wanted to make this effect a little bit more presentable. And I'll also clean this file up a little bit, and I'll also provide you with the Nuke project in case you want to check this out as well. But that's pretty much all I wanted to cover, so I hope you liked this tutorial. I hope you found it useful. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.